Hello and welcome to episode 17 of the AST podcast. This week we have Rev Dr. Ross Bartlett, whose new book is available now, or
Yeah,
just
it
about.
is. It
Fantastic.
is.
And the title?
Speaking Church, a new vision for the suburban congregation.
Fantastic. So highly recommended. Get your hands on a copy. Ross is very, very, very kindly agreed to join us in this video chat fashion to cut down on the transmission of my heinous flu. And so thanks very much to Ross for this. Our topic is on Lent, particularly Lent in the United Church of Canada, and the issues and the areas that will allow us to get into. So I'm wondering if, to start us off, Ross, you could basically just tell us a little bit about Lent in the United Church of Canada. Is it something that's recognized? Is it something that's entirely ignored? What's its status?
Okay, to understand an answer to that question, we have to go back maybe 40 or 50 years, which won't take as long as it sounds. But we need to think of the United Church prior to the influence of the liturgical renewal movement, and then after the liturgical renewal movement. From our Methodist and Presbyterian Congregationalist roots, we inherited a form of worship that had very little color in it in terms of banners and hangings and antipendia and so on. Certainly did not use any form of common lectionary. And so to speak of what was happening across the church would be tremendously difficult, because every preacher was responsible to choose her or his texts, and they would be doing all sorts of things. And we had very few of what might be called liturgical actions beyond a fairly simple and austere form of sacrament of communion and in baptism. Those were sort of the high points. And so Lent, at least as when I was growing up in the United Church, had very few special marks to it. There were no changes to antipendia, to vestments, or anything like that. Ash Wednesday, Maundy Thursday would probably be avoided as either Anglican or Papist, and we didn't do those sorts of things. Good Friday would be a lengthy, like a 3-hour penitential sort of service. And if there was any marking of Lent, it would be highly penitential and very much based in an atonement theology. And this is why Jesus had to die, because I'm such a miserable sinner. And I'm going to spend all this time learning about it and acknowledging it. So that was pretty much the pattern as I was growing up. I remember sometime in my youth, the radical thing of an Easter sunrise service came in. So that was really pushing the edge. Now, as we move into the 80s, 70s, and the 80s and beyond, what we have is a series of professors and instructors in United Church theological colleges who are touched by the liturgical renewal movement and then begin to pass that on to their students, and that begins to move out through the church, not in any sort of mandated fashion. You see, in the United Church of Canada, I'm just going to mute that.
No problem with it. Yep.
In the United Church of Canada, worship is the responsibility of the local session. And one of our founding articles is that the national church cannot impose a form of worship on local congregations. And that's very, very much held. And so it's a matter of more of a persuasive growth as people and graduates of seminaries take their ideas into congregations, that these things begin to pick up, and we begin to, as
Right.
United Church, bring in items and practices and ideas which are ours as part of the common Christian heritage. So you begin to see a marking of seasons. In my growing up, there were days like Easter and Pentecost and Christmas, but there really were no seasons. And so we
Right.
begin to see the incorporation of seasons. And so you begin to actually talk about a season of Lent, which is begun with an Ash Wednesday service. And my guess would be, and because of the nature of how worship is done in the church, it's very difficult to talk about what is common in the United Church. But I would imagine that most United churches in some way or another would either have an Ash Wednesday service or would go together with a neighboring congregation, perhaps Anglican or Presbyterian, for an Ash Wednesday. It would not be well attended. There would not be huge numbers of people, but there would be a solid core. And the same might be said at the other end of Lent with Maundy Thursday. You would likely find some sort of Maundy Thursday observance, either as a recreation of the foot washing, the new commandment, or as a celebration of the institution of the Lord's Supper. And in between, you would find changes in color, and you might very well find particular practices. So in some United churches, there is the practice, whereas in Advent, you light candles leading towards the grand day of Christmas. In some places, there is a practice of extinguishing candles to symbolically recognize the growing tension and struggle and conflict in the biblical story. And of course, in many churches, I would guess 80% would be a conservative guess, people are following a lectionary, usually the Revised Common Lectionary. And so in the narrative of the lectionary, you have this move towards Easter and Good Friday. In some places, you will find Holy Week services. Those are less common. Often they're in places where a ministerial can share them around between congregations.
Right.
One thing that I will say about our observation of Lent, I don't know for how long, but it would be decades. The United Church has always produced a Lenten devotional.
Okay.
Always produced this Lenten daily devotional, very much personally focused. It's not a community thing. It's not a group thing. It's an individual. There'd be a passage and a reflection and a prayer, and maybe there'd be one or two questions to think about. And that's, if I looked in the AST library, I could probably go back to the 1960s, even the 1950s with those. So that's the general pattern.
Right. One of the things which interests me, and an awful lot there interests me, but one of the things which interests me is it might be too extreme to talk about it as a real positive in terms of ecumenism, but I know even to this day, we understand ourselves denominationally, partially in opposition to what the others do.
Yes.
And so, for example, when I'm talking about various organizational reforms in the Roman Catholic Church, someone will sort of say, well, that really sounds like, sort of a Protestant model, as if that therefore means it's wrong and we can't do it. Is there a sense in which, maybe not in the 70s and the 80s, but in the past, there is a clear identification that there are things like Popish processions and superstition, and these are core things that Reformed Christians understand themselves in contrast to, and therefore that influences like liturgical seasons and things like that.
Yes, and that's certainly part of our heritage, and the sense that worship is simple,
Yes, yes, yes.
relatively plain. It's can't tell you when the debate would be about bringing musical instruments into the church. That would probably predate church union, but if there was a choir procession, there would not be a lot of pomp and circumstance to that, comparatively speaking. As I said, vestments, those clergy that wore vestments would probably wear black Geneva gowns. There would be no albs. There would be no changing of stoles or anything like that. And things like in putting on ashes, for example, for Ash Wednesday.
Yeah.
That would be seen as something that they did. That they did it, and that would take away from the pure worship, which is very much focused on the word and the way the word touches us. So one of the things that the liturgical renewal movement brings to my tradition is an appreciation of other senses, so that sight, sound, smell less, but to a certain extent, scent. These are all things that we have acquired, and in some cases we've acquired them quite willy-nilly, and sometimes the results are really beautiful. Sometimes they are quite horrific. I was part of a group once that was asked to investigate one of my colleagues in another city, in another province, who was baptizing with autumn leaves, but that's the story for another time, because they were colorful.
Right. Yeah,
but that's got nothing to do with Lent. But yeah, so not all of the adoptions were happy, but many of them have been in a sense of deepening people's appreciation of the significance of this time period. And increasingly, I would say that our observation of Lent is not so much penitential as it is introspective, so that the sense is that the events of the Easter weekend, Good Friday to the resurrection, relate to us, but they're not solely because we are, in Calvin's words, a worm 5 feet high, that by the debasing of ourselves and the elevating of the suffering and all the rest really doesn't accomplish what needs to happen in terms of our relationship to the divine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are there any noticeable, or were there noticeable differences? Like when one thinks of Calvinist strands and Wesleyan strands, one thinks of very, very different forms of worship and different emphases. Are these legacies still prevalent? Do they still inform the genetic memory of different congregations?
Not really. You'd have to go back. We're coming up on 100 years since the Union. Our first book of forms, which was our first worship book, was published in 1930. But by the Second World War, certainly by the beginning of the 1960s, we have a generation of clergy, church leaders who remember nothing of the pre-Union time. The place where you might see the pre-Union influence is sometimes in the physical structure of a church sanctuary, where one strand would likely have pulpit and lectern. The other strand would probably have a center lectern pulpit. But even that gets changed as in the interior of churches get modified. And so now it would be very difficult. Somebody really attuned to architecture and church architecture might be able to go into some of our older buildings and say, this was Methodist, or this was Presbyterian. That would be touch and go. So it by the 1960s, certainly we are well into a generation of leadership that does not remember communion. And so those strands, and one of the things that United Church historians like Phyllis Earhart have observed is that one of the reasons why union worked so easily was that by the time union came along, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists looked and sounded pretty much the same. There might be, but there was a generalized order of worship which seems to have been copied over. There were different hymn books, and so you'd get different songs, but it didn't feel that different. It wouldn't be, for example, the same as if the United Church were all of a sudden to enter into a union with the Quakers. And we would go from services filled with words to times of absolute silence. There was just, it wasn't a transition like that.
Yeah. There's a number of things that are, that strike me at AST. And one of the things is the appetite that United Church students tend to have for the mystical, the sensory. How long has this been going on for, if it is indeed representative of the United Church today?
Certainly it was present in the 1980s when I was starting in congregational ministry in a small group of people. Again, it's part of the growing awareness of the shared Christian heritage, of which we are a part. It's also a matter of the growing awareness and the popularizing of some practices which might very well have been associated with monasticism or the mystical, mystical edges of the church. These, for example, and that sort of. And so the growth of Benedictine spirituality and so what happens, I think, is that there is certainly an aspect of the Christian character which is touched by the mystical and is formed, positively formed by various disciplines. But in the United Church writ large, there's not much place for them. It was pretty cerebral. It was pretty, these are the rules. Keep your. But it wasn't necessarily particularly demanding. I like to characterize the Christianity that I grew up with was basic, decent citizenship plus an hour on Sunday morning. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot more to it.
Right. Yeah.
So instead, I would imagine in previous generations, folk like those that you're referring to and some of our AST students and there'd be a small component in every congregation might very well have gravitated to other traditions. They might have moved out of the United Church entirely and moved to places where those emphases were more celebrated. Today, it's okay. It's okay to have these interests. Many congregations will have groups that explore these things, these various disciplines from time to time. Again, it's a reappropriating of our common tradition, but it is noticeable because people who are looking for that, unless you've grown up in sort of specific congregations with specific practices and perhaps specific clergy leadership, you may not have encountered it. So it's a new world of wonder that touches a particular part of your spirit.
Yeah, one thing which I don't know how to interpret it, but I see it on Lent has gotten an awful lot bigger in the last 2 or 3 years, I think, among young Catholic social media. And I don't know exactly why this is, but I think there's a little bit of jealousy about the coolness of Islam. Um, it's a really weird thing, but I think an awful lot of young millennial Roman Catholics are looking at signs of distinction, and so veiling and things like that, and with the implicit victim chic that is sort of that accompanies it, and are very, very keen for it. And so in the last few years, the when I was growing up, and even for my kids, who haven't reached that age yet, you sort of you kind of hope the smudge will go away pretty quickly. Now the people seem to be hoping that they last for days, and they're trying to just flaunt it. Is that strange, partially neurotic thing present at all in the United Church, or
Well, it does tie into Lent and our observance of Lent. I think in some way that there are people of many generations who are looking for maybe a more demanding expectation of their faith. And so Lent becomes a place where there are opportunities. It's a defined period of time where you can either deny yourself or take something up. And so, for example, there are remarkably popular websites like the 40 Acts of Stewardship out of the United Kingdom, where each day, if you sign up, and you can do this both as a community and as individuals, you can sign up, and each day you'll receive an email with, and usually they go in 3 tracks. There's the simple track, the medium track, and the really extreme track. But each day there is something that you can do, and it's not stewardship solely confined to money, but it's how do you steward your Christian life in a way that makes a difference. So each day you get an increasingly firm kick in the butt to get out and do something. You can do and that's very popular because people, I think, there's this, for many people in the United Church anyway, there's the sense that I want to move it beyond where I am, but I'm not really into the mission trip thing, and I'm certainly not going to go door to door evangelizing. And I'm not really sure whether I want to stick out at the office as a Bible thumper. But this is something that I can do. I can be nice to my neighbor, or I can something like that. And that's one thing that has certainly changed in the United Church over the decades. People have moved from giving up things for Lent to an increasing number of people who are taking up things for Lent, so that they will take up some form of either spiritual practice or some sort of social activity, so that they will make a point of greeting a stranger in a friendly fashion each day, or they will actually take the time to spend a few minutes in meditation, or a whole host of things, adding things to life rather than depriving oneself of stuff. There is a funny story about a seminary student, United Church seminary student in the 1980s, who was into this. She was going to deny herself chocolate for Lent, and of course you're getting into that period of term when things are getting really tense, final essays, and all the rest of it. And so somebody had given her one of those gold-wrapped chocolate bunnies for Easter, and she had it on her desk, and she was not going to use it. And then somebody introduced her to the fact that actually each Sunday of Lent is a mini resurrection. So you do those things that you are fasting from. So here she was on Saturday working away the bunnies up there, And then, bright student that she was, she realized from her Old Testament class that the Jewish day started at sundown. So sundown on Saturday, she was into that chocolate wrap. But like some of the things that people give up for Lent, and that's sort of a cool thing. But more and more people are taking things up. But back to your question, I can't speak for Roman Catholic youth, but I think for people in the United Church, there's a sense that at least for this period, I want my faith to demand a little bit more of.
Yeah, and I suppose in recent years, recent generations, maybe there's been a focus on the body and an awareness and appreciation for how bodies can be shaped through physical practices, of course, but also mental and spiritual practices. And this, I suppose, has led to many Christians going, "Hey, we've got lots of stuff on that,"
Yes, sure.
and returning to like the slightly archaic traditions with a new vigor, aware of how they can, to use Patrick Kavanagh's words, charm back the luxury of a child's soul. Yeah. One thing I'm always, and again, I know there's no clear answer to this, but it's something I'm always fascinated about in the United Church of Canada. The significant emphasis on scripture, which emerged from the Second Vatican Council, I think was helpful in helping reform some Roman Catholic traditions. And so Roman Catholic traditions and pietistic practices have been ongoing for centuries because they had always been ongoing. And the turn to scripture provided a space to perhaps investigate them and examine them and say, well, maybe this is coherently tied to scripture, and this is just some bizarre pagan rite that we started doing for various reasons. But there's a sense of a sort of a process of reform there, which was also mapped by, I think, a loss of authority in the years directly following the council, when people did things like baptize with leaves and things like that. And so my question is, when there is a turn to the sensory and when there is liturgical experimentation and a whole host of things, what are the kinds of habits of mind, or indeed, you mentioned that you were investigating that particular case, ecclesial politics, which can help shape these things in a coherent way rather than a bizarre, affected, problematic way?
I think from one perspective, I think the training and nurturing of clergy in coherent and solid liturgical leadership is really
right.
important. That training of worship leaders in not just certain practices, but in the capability to reflect on
the core logic of how it works. Yeah,
it's not just that you're going to do something because it looks really cool, but you need to think about what it is, as a worship leader, what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. Yeah. And I think increasingly, certainly when we talk, we're doing much more about the theology of our worship practices rather than just learning the worship practices, because we recognize that United Church clergy have that freedom along with their congregation to shape worship experiences, and we want them to be grounded. Now, every now and again, it's like anything else. Every now and again, I've done this, you try something and it really doesn't work, or you try something and it has a very different response. Oh, well, we won't do that again, but that's okay. Right, yeah. But I think that, and in our magazines, our periodicals within the church, I will from time to time read about services that people have tried. And often I'm very impressed both with the creativity, but also the faithfulness. Now, they aren't necessarily services that I could pull off. I'm just not wired in that way for some of them. But I can recognize the faithful strands there in people's creativity. And so, yeah, sometimes in pushing the edge, sometimes people fall off. But the vast majority of the church ends up. I think what we're trying to do is honor the fact that the senses are important in our
Yes, yeah.
worship and appreciation of the divine. And but when the door was opened, all sorts of things got tried. I mean, in the 1970s in the United Church of Canada, the norm seemed to be that every week the clergy had to come up with an entirely different service, like every week, everything, and because the sort of the shackles had come off.
Yes. There was a similar, although much shorter-lived, analog within Roman Catholicism after the Council, before order was very quickly reasserted. And so, if you had any tips, you've you've written a lot about. About spiritual practices and about ways in which we can live in core Kairos time. What would you say to our listeners and viewers if you were to leave them with some tips for how they could get the most out of whatever that means, the Lenten season?
Well, the Lenten season has some wonderful things going for it, from the planner of the life of a congregation or a congregation's worship, in that it is a bounded period of time. And my experience suggests that whatever we do, if we can say to a congregation, well, we're not doing this forever, we're just going to have, this is just an experiment. My experience is that by the time the end of the experiment, most people will tell you, well, we've always done that anyway. But if you can go to a congregation and say, we're going to try this, don't get your knickers in a twist, we're just going to try it. And after Easter, we'll do something else. It's good. It's a good time for a smaller group to gather for a discipline, to practice a particular spiritual practice or particular spiritual discipline. And who knows, after you're done, some after Easter, some may choose to continue it. It's a good time. One of the things that in my latter years in pastoral ministry we used to do is we would take a fast from meetings during Lent and use that time for church community learning about something. And our most frequent, by request, our most frequent time requested topic was our neighbors of other faith. And these were probably the best attended educational events that we ever held. So the neighbors in the community who are of other faiths, and it wasn't a matter of conversion or confrontation, it was a matter of understanding, and those worked very well. Introducing into worship things that may be new to the congregation, different forms of confession, different forms of prayer, different forms of action. It's a wonderful time when those experiments in worship or experiments in spiritual practice seem to be welcome, or at least welcomed by many and accepted by the rest. And so to use the period, my preference would be not to create a smorgasbord of different things each week, but each year to choose something that you think will resonate with the congregation and which will build towards a future which is more than just Lent as a one-off in the year.
Right. Wonderful stuff. And finally, what would you suggest for people? How do we navigate the line? And this is a very difficult question, I apologize for it, between, on the one hand, an awareness that Christ is calling us to more, that Christ is calling us to a mode of being in the world which goes beyond what we're seemingly capable of in the live our lives, and that Calvinist emphasis on utter depravity, which seems to be maybe counterproductive to that. How do pastors and congregations navigate accepting and appreciating the challenge that Lent represents, while also not surrendering to the absolute despair of human depravity?
I don't think in the United Church, the United Church is vast and broad, and I'm quite aware of that. I don't think you would find a tremendous amount of emphasis on the utter depravity anymore.
Right.
There is an awareness of insufficiency, not enough. We are not who either God made us to be, or quite frankly, who we want to be. And that in our relationship with Christ, we have the call and also the opportunity to grow towards those things that are made to be, and that redemption means many things, but redemption also means the fact that we can, by God's grace, do and be more. And we do that. I think the best way to say that, to frame that, is to frame it out of gratitude. God has given us this, therefore, rather than getting into any sort of works righteousness. God's always out there before us doing things. Even before I made a choice, and this is my Wesleyan heritage, God's Spirit was already in there working. So it's never really my choice. It may be my response to what God has done. And so as part of that response, we want to live differently. And that's also how to frame Lent
in terms of avoiding that's also how to frame Lent in terms of avoiding a works-based righteousness, that prevenient grace as the spur to the various practices.
And gratitude is an emotion and a feeling that most people recognize. And so gratitude for what has come into our lives by the action of the divine is not a big step for many people. The bigger step is how to actually put that gratitude into action. And that's where Lenten preaching and Lenten study groups, Lenten examples of various practices can be helpful.
Excellent. Ross, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for agreeing to this format, which is very helpful for me. I'm not sure how helpful it'll be to our listeners and viewers, but it certainly has got me out of a bind today.
Well, glad to be of help, and hope you are feeling better soon.
I hope so too. Ross, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.